The dust from the overturned stagecoach still hung in the Arizona air when Julia Vance first laid eyes on the cowboy, who would change everything she thought she knew about her future. The attack had come swift and brutal, bandits descending on the coach as it made its way toward Fort Bowie in the scorching summer heat of 1878. Julia had been thrown clear when the driver lost control, her traveling trunk spilling her carefully packed belongings across the desert floor. Now she sat in the dirt, her dark hair falling loose from its pins, watching as a tall figure on horseback chased down the last of the fleeing outlaws. The man rode like he was born in the saddle, his movements fluid and sure as he fired a warning shot that sent the bandits scrambling for cover. Within minutes, the threat had passed, and he was dismounting near where Julia sat, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust. "Are you hurt, miss?" His voice was deep, touched with a Texas drawl that made something flutter unexpectedly in her chest. Julia looked up at him, shielding her eyes from the sun. He was young, perhaps 25, with sandy brown hair and eyes the color of whiskey. A day's worth of stubble shadowed his jaw, and concern creased his brow as he extended a gloved hand toward her. "I think I am unharmed," she managed, accepting his help. His grip was strong and steady, and she found herself reluctant to let go once she was on her feet. "Thank you, Mr. Blake Ashford, madam. Just happened to be riding this way when I heard the commotion." He released her hand slowly, his gaze sweeping over her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You sure you are all right? That was quite a tumble." "I am certain." Julia brushed at her dusty skirts, suddenly aware of how disheveled she must look. The other passengers were beginning to emerge from their various hiding spots, and the driver was cursing as he examined his wounded arm. "Though I fear our driver may need assistance." Blake moved immediately to help, his efficiency speaking of someone accustomed to taking charge in difficult situations. Julia watched as he tore strips from his own shirt to bind the driver's wound, his hands gentle despite their obvious strength. There was something about him that drew her attention again and again, something beyond his undeniable physical appeal. It took nearly an hour to right the stagecoach and determine it was still functional enough to complete the journey. During that time, Julia learned that Blake Ashford worked at a ranch just outside Fort Bowie, that he had been raised in Texas after his parents died in a cholera outbreak when he was 15, and that he had a quick smile that transformed his entire face. She also learned that her heart was capable of racing at the mere sound of his laugh, which was a complication she most certainly did not need. "Fort Bowie is about 2 hours from here," Blake said as the driver prepared to continue the journey. "I will ride alongside. Make sure you all get there safely." "That is very kind of you, Mr. Ashford," Julia replied, trying to ignore the way her pulse jumped at the prospect of his continued presence. The remainder of the journey passed in a blur of stolen glances and brief exchanges whenever the coach stopped to rest the horses. Blake rode close to her window, and Julia found excuses to lean out and speak with him. He told her about the ranch where he worked, about the wild beauty of the Arizona territory, about his dreams of someday having his own spread. And Julia, despite knowing better, despite the weight of duty that pressed upon her shoulders, found herself sharing pieces of her own story. How she had grown up in Philadelphia, how her father had been a banker before he passed 2 years ago, how her mother had died when she was only 6 years old. What she did not tell him was why she was traveling to Fort Bowie. That confession felt too heavy, too final to speak aloud to this stranger who made her laugh with his stories of stubborn cattle, and who looked at her like she was something precious and unexpected. When Fort Bowie finally came into view, Julia felt an unexpected surge of regret. The small military outpost looked stark against the desert landscape, a collection of adobe buildings surrounded by a wooden palisade. It was nothing like Philadelphia, nothing like any place she had ever been. Blake helped her down from the stagecoach once it rolled to a stop inside the fort, his hands spanning her waist with easy strength. For a moment, they stood close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his eyes, close enough that she could smell leather and sage and something uniquely him. "Where are you staying, Miss Vance?" he asked, his voice rough around the edges in a way that sent warmth pooling in her stomach. "I am to meet someone here," she said, reality crashing back over her like cold water. She swallowed hard. "My intended." Something flickered across Blake's face there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "Your intended," he repeated flatly. "Yes, it was arranged by correspondence. He is the commander of the fort, Captain Theodore Winters." The words tasted like ash in her mouth. "We are to be married next month." Blake took a step back, his expression carefully neutral now. "I see. Then I suppose congratulations are in order." Before Julia could respond, before she could explain that this marriage was not what she wanted, but rather what she owed to her late father's business partner who had arranged the match, a tall man in a crisp uniform approached them. "You must be Miss Julia Vance," the man said, his voice clipped and formal. He was perhaps 40, with iron-gray hair and pale blue eyes that assessed her with the same detachment one might show when examining livestock. "I am Captain Theodore Winters. Your journey was satisfactory." "We were attacked by bandits, sir," Blake said, his tone cold. "But everyone survived." Theodore barely glanced at him. "The territory can be dangerous for those unprepared for it. Fortunately, Julia will have no need to travel once we are wed. She will remain safely within the fort." He offered his arm to Julia with all the warmth of a business transaction. "Come, I will show you to your quarters. The chaplain's wife has prepared rooms for you." Julia looked back at Blake as Theodore led her away. The cowboy stood in the dusty courtyard, his hat in his hands, watching her with an expression that made her chest ache. She wanted to run back to him, wanted to explain that this marriage to Theodore was about honoring debts and obligations, not about love or desire. But duty had been drilled into her since childhood, and so she simply turned away and followed the man she was promised to marry into the fort that would become her cage. The quarters Theodore showed her to were small but clean. 2 rooms in a building near the back of the fort. The chaplain's wife, a kind-faced woman named Martha, helped her settle in and promised to bring supper later. "Captain Winters is a good man," Martha said as she helped Julia unpack her damaged trunk. "Stern, perhaps, but fair. You will want for nothing as his wife." "Except love," Julia thought but did not say. "Except passion. Except the feeling that had sparked to life in her chest when a sandy-haired cowboy had pulled her to her feet in the desert." That evening, Theodore joined her for supper in the small sitting room. He spoke at length about his military career, about the importance of discipline and order, about his expectations for their marriage. Julia would be expected to manage his household, to entertain other officers and their wives, to provide him with children in due course. "I trust this all meets with your approval," Theodore said, though his tone suggested he neither expected nor particularly cared about her response. "Of course," Julia replied automatically, the words she had been taught to say. Over the following days, Julia settled into an uncomfortable routine. Theodore called on her each evening, their conversations stilted and formal. He showed no interest in her thoughts or feelings, treating her instead as an acquisition to be managed and displayed. And every day, Julia found her thoughts drifting to Blake Ashford, wondering where he was, what he was doing, whether he ever thought of her. She got her answer nearly a week after her arrival when she ventured outside the fort with Martha to visit the small market that set up on Saturdays. The chaplain's wife insisted it was perfectly safe with the military presence, and Julia was desperate for any excuse to escape the confining walls. The market was a colorful affair, locals and ranch hands mingling to trade goods and news. Julia was examining a display of woven baskets when she felt the prickle of awareness along her spine that meant someone was watching her. She turned and found Blake standing a few yards away, his eyes locked on her face with an intensity that stole her breath. He looked tired, she thought, shadows under his eyes that had not been there before. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other across the crowded market. Then Martha called to Julia to look at some fabric, and the spell broke. Blake tipped his hat to her, a gesture of courtesy that somehow felt intimate, and turned to walk away. Julia made a decision in that instant that would have scandalized the proper Philadelphia society matrons who had overseen her upbringing. She murmured an excuse to Martha and followed Blake through the market, her heart pounding so hard she was certain everyone could hear it. He did not go far, just to the edge of the market where horses were tethered in the shade. When Julia caught up to him, he turned to face her with a mixture of surprise and something else, something heated and hungry that made her feel reckless. "Miss Vance, you should not be here," he said, his voice strained. "If your intended sees you speaking with me—" "Theodore is reviewing troops this morning," Julia interrupted. "And I—" She faltered, suddenly unsure. What was she doing? What could she possibly say to this man she barely knew but could not stop thinking about? Blake stepped closer, close enough that she could have reached out and touched him if she dared. "You what?" he asked softly. "I cannot stop thinking about you," she whispered, the confession torn from somewhere deep inside her. "I know it is wrong. I know I am promised to another. But when I am with Theodore, all I can think about is how different everything felt when you helped me from that stagecoach." Something fierce and possessive flashed in Blake's eyes. "Julia." Her name on his lips was a prayer and a curse. "You do not know what you are saying." "I do." She met his gaze steadily, years of careful propriety crumbling in the face of this overwhelming need to be honest with him. "I know exactly what I am saying. I am engaged to a man I do not love, a man who sees me as nothing more than a useful addition to his household. And I am thinking about a cowboy who looked at me like I mattered, like I was someone worth saving." Blake made a rough sound low in his throat. His hand came up, hovering near her cheek but not quite touching. "Your engagement, this promise to Winters, was it your choice?" "It was my duty," Julia replied. "Theodore was a business associate of my father. When father died, he left debts that I could not pay. Theodore offered to settle them in exchange for my hand in marriage. I accepted because I had no other options, because it was what a good daughter should do." "And what does your heart say?" Blake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do you want, Julia? Setting aside duty and obligation and what you think you should do?" The question hung between them, weighted with possibility. Julia looked up at this man who made her feel alive in ways she had never experienced, who made her want things she had been taught were improper to even consider. "I want," she began, then stopped, gathering courage. "I want to know what it feels like to be chosen, not acquired. I want to laugh and be heard when I speak. I want—" She swallowed hard. "I want to feel what I felt when you looked at me in the desert, like I was someone remarkable." Blake's control visibly snapped. His hand finally made contact with her face, cupping her cheek with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the intensity in his eyes. "You are remarkable," he said fiercely. "You are brave and beautiful, and you deserve so much more than a marriage of convenience to a man who does not see what a gift you would be." Blake. His name was a plea, though for what she was not entirely sure. Follow your heart, not your duty, he said, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with devastating tenderness. I know I have no right to ask this of you, no claim on you at all. But Julia, if there is any part of you that wants something different, something more, then do not walk into that marriage because you think you have no choice. But my father's debts can be paid in other ways. I have some money saved. It is not much, but it is yours if you need it. And there are other options, other solutions that do not require you to sacrifice your entire future. His hand dropped to his side, and he took a step back, giving her space. I am not asking you to choose me, Julia. I am asking you to choose yourself, to give yourself permission to want more than a cold marriage to a man who will never value you the way you deserve. Julia felt tears prick at her eyes. In her entire life, no one had ever suggested that what she wanted mattered more than her obligations. The very idea was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. I do not even know you, she said weakly, though her heart was already reaching for him, already imagining a different future than the one she had resigned herself to. Then let me court you properly, Blake said. Let me show you what it could be like. And then, if you still wish to marry Winters, I will step aside and trouble you no more. But Julia, give yourself a chance to choose. Give us a chance. Before she could respond, Martha's voice called out, looking for her. Blake squeezed her hand once, quickly, and then he was gone, disappearing into the crowd of the market like a dream. Julia returned to Martha in a daze, her mind spinning with possibilities and fears. That night, as Theodore droned on about military protocols over supper, she barely heard a word he said. All she could think about was Blake's words, his touch, the way he had looked at her like she hung the moon and stars. Follow your heart, not your duty. The question was whether she was brave enough to do so. Over the following weeks, Julia found ways to see Blake. They were careful, meeting in places where they would not draw immediate attention, stealing moments whenever she could slip away from Theodore's watchful expectations. Blake courted her with a patience and care that made her fall harder with each passing day. He brought her wildflowers picked from the desert, their bright blooms defiant against the harsh landscape. He taught her to ride properly, his hand steady on her waist as he helped her into the saddle, his voice encouraging when she grew frustrated. They talked for hours, sharing stories and dreams and fears. Julia learned that Blake had been alone most of his life, that he yearned for a family and a place to belong. She told him about growing up under the strict guidance of governesses, about the loneliness of trying to be the perfect daughter her father had wanted. You are already perfect, Blake told her one evening as they sat by a small creek outside the fort. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Not because you follow every rule or meet every expectation, but because you are kind and brave and you make me want to be better than I am. Julia leaned her head against his shoulder, breathing in the scent of him. Theodore has set our wedding date, she said quietly, 3 weeks from today. She felt Blake tense beside her. And what do you want, Julia? Not what you think you should do, but what you truly want. I want to be with you, she admitted, the words simple but profound. I want to wake up beside you every morning. I want to build a life with you, whatever that looks like. But Blake, I am terrified. If I break this engagement, there will be consequences. Theodore has made it clear that he expects me to honor our agreement, and even if I could find a way to pay my father's debts, society will say I am ruined, that I brought shame on myself by breaking a promise. Blake turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. In the dying light, his eyes looked almost molten. I will not lie to you and say it will be easy, but Julia, I love you. I have loved you since the moment you looked up at me in that desert with dust on your face and fire in your eyes. And I am asking you to take a chance on us, on what we could build together. You love me, Julia's voice broke on the words. With everything I am, Blake confirmed. I love your strength and your compassion. I love the way you laugh when you forget to be proper. I love that you snore a little when you sleep in the saddle after a long ride. I do not snore, Julia protested, but she was laughing through her tears. You absolutely do, Blake said, grinning. Then his expression grew serious once more. Marry me, Julia. Not because of duty or debt, but because you want to. Because we choose each other. Julia looked at this man who had shown her what it meant to be truly seen and valued. She thought about the life stretching before her with Theodore, decades of cold formality and emotional isolation. And she thought about the life she could have with Blake, full of love and laughter and genuine partnership. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I will marry you. Blake kissed her then, his lips claiming hers with a tenderness that quickly deepened into passion. Julia had never been kissed before, had never known that such connection was possible. She melted into him, her hands fisting in his shirt, trying to get closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Blake rested his forehead against hers. We need to leave tonight, he said. If we wait, Winters will find a way to stop us. Reality crashed back over Julia. Leave? But where would we go? I have a friend who is a justice of the peace in Tucson. It is a 2-day ride from here. We can be married there, and then we will figure out the rest together. He pulled back to look at her seriously. But Julia, once we do this, there is no going back. Winters will be furious and there may be legal complications. Are you certain this is what you want? Julia thought about every moment she had spent with Blake, every laugh they had shared, every dream they had woven together. She thought about the way her heart felt full when he was near, the way she could be completely herself without fear of judgment. I am certain, she said firmly. I want this. I want you. I want the life we will build together. They made their plans quickly. Blake would return to the ranch where he worked to collect his savings and his belongings. Julia would return to the fort and pack what she could carry. They would meet at midnight at the creek, and then they would ride for Tucson and a new beginning. Julia returned to her quarters with her heart pounding and her mind racing. She moved through supper with Theodore in a fog, barely registering his discussion of wedding preparations. When he finally left for the evening, she began the delicate process of deciding what to take with her. She could not bring much, only what would fit in a single bag that she could carry on horseback. She chose practical clothing, a few precious mementos of her parents, and the small amount of money she had saved. Everything else, all the trappings of her old life, would be left behind. Martha knocked on her door just as Julia was finishing her packing. The older woman took in the scene with shrewd eyes and closed the door softly behind her. So you are leaving, Martha said. It was not a question. Julia considered lying but found she could not. Yes. With that cowboy, the one who saved you from the bandits. Again, not a question. Martha sighed and sat down heavily. I cannot say I am surprised. I have seen the way you look at each other when you think no one is watching. Are you going to tell Theodore? Julia asked, her throat tight. Martha was quiet for a long moment. No, she said finally. I was in an arranged marriage once, you see. My first husband. He was a good man in his way, but there was no love between us, no warmth. When he died, I felt guilty for the relief I felt. She looked up at Julia with sad eyes. When I married again to the chaplain, I chose for myself. I chose love, and it has made all the difference. I am sorry, Julia whispered. I know this will cause trouble for you. I will manage. Martha stood and crossed to Julia, pressing a small pouch into her hands. It is not much, but it will help. Go, child. Choose love while you still can. Julia hugged the older woman tightly, tears streaming down her face. Thank you. Be happy, Martha said simply. That is thanks enough." When midnight came, Julia slipped from her quarters like a ghost. The fort was quiet, most of the soldiers either asleep or focused on their patrol duties. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she made her way to the gate, certain that at any moment someone would stop her. But no one did. She passed through the shadows unchallenged and made her way to the creek, where Blake waited with 2 horses. "I was starting to worry," he admitted, pulling her into his arms the moment she was close enough. "I am here," Julia said, breathing in the scent of him, letting it steady her fraying nerves. "I am here and I am yours." They rode through the night, the desert landscape ghostly under the moon. Blake set a pace that was quick but manageable, clearly wanting to put distance between them and Fort Bowie as quickly as possible. As dawn broke across the horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and rose, Julia felt something loosen in her chest. Every mile they traveled was a mile further from duty and obligation, a mile closer to the life she had chosen for herself. They stopped briefly to rest the horses and eat the supplies Blake had packed. Julia was exhausted, her body aching from the unfamiliar exertion of riding for so many hours, but she was also exhilarated. "Are you all right?" Blake asked, coming to sit beside her in the shade of a large rock formation. "I am wonderful," Julia said and meant it. "Tired and sore, but wonderful." Blake smiled and wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her against his side. "We should reach a way station by nightfall. You can rest properly there, and we will make Tucson tomorrow." True to his word, they arrived at a small way station as the sun was setting. The proprietor, a weathered man named Sam, asked no questions when Blake paid for a room and meals. Julia fell asleep almost immediately, curled against Blake's side, feeling safer than she had in years. The next day's ride passed in a blur. Julia's muscles protested every movement, but Blake was patient, stopping frequently to let her rest and stretch. They talked as they rode, planning the future they would build together. "The ranch where I work, the owner has been talking about retiring," Blake told her. "He has offered to sell me a portion of the land at a fair price if I can come up with the money. It is not much, maybe enough for a small house and room for some cattle. But it would be ours, Julia. We could build something there." "That sounds perfect," Julia said, meaning it with every fiber of her being. She did not need grand houses or society events. All she needed was Blake and the chance to build a life together. They reached Tucson in the late afternoon. The town was larger than Fort Bowie, a bustling hub of commerce and activity. Blake led them through the streets to a small white church near the center of town. His friend, Justice Samuel Turner, was a jovial man with a ready smile and knowing eyes. He took one look at them, dusty and travel-worn but clearly in love, and ushered them inside without hesitation. "You are certain about this?" Samuel asked, though he was already pulling out the necessary papers. "No doubts, no second thoughts." Blake looked at Julia, his eyes warm and sure. "No doubts." "None," Julia agreed, her hand finding his. They were married as the sun set over Tucson, the ceremony simple but profound. Julia wore her dusty traveling clothes and carried no flowers, but when Blake slipped a simple silver band onto her finger and kissed her as his wife, she felt like the most beautiful woman in the world. Samuel arranged for them to stay at a boarding house run by his sister, a practical woman who asked no uncomfortable questions. The room was small but clean, and after a simple supper, Blake and Julia finally found themselves alone as husband and wife. "Are you happy?" Blake asked, pulling Julia into his arms as they stood in the lamplight. "So happy I can hardly breathe," Julia admitted. She reached up to cup his face, marveling that she was allowed to touch him like this now, that he was truly hers. "I love you, Blake Ashford. I love you more than I knew it was possible to love anyone." "I love you too," Blake murmured against her lips. "My brave, beautiful wife." That night, Blake showed Julia with gentle patience what it meant to be cherished and desired. He was tender and careful, making sure her first time was filled with pleasure rather than pain. And Julia, who had spent so many years locked away from passion and emotion, finally understood what all the poetry and songs had been trying to express. In the morning, they woke tangled together, and Julia felt a bone-deep contentment she had never known before. This was what she had been missing, this sense of belonging, of being exactly where she was meant to be. They spent several days in Tucson, enjoying the anonymity the larger town afforded them. Blake showed her around, introducing her to the sights and sounds of the frontier town. They ate at a small restaurant, walked through the market, and spent their evenings wrapped in each other's arms. But reality could not be held at bay forever. On their fourth day in Tucson, Blake returned from the general store with news that Captain Theodore Winters was in town, making inquiries about a missing woman matching Julia's description. "We need to face this," Blake said grimly. "He is not going to simply let you go, and I would rather confront him now on our terms than be constantly looking over our shoulders." Julia's stomach churned with anxiety, but she knew he was right. "What do you propose?" "We meet with him. We explain that you are married now, that you made your choice freely, and we make it clear that you are not going back with him." Blake took her hands in his. "I will not let him hurt you or force you into anything, Julia. I swear it." They arranged the meeting for that afternoon in Samuel's office, with the justice present as a witness and neutral party. When Theodore arrived, his face was a mask of cold fury. "Julia," he said, his voice like ice, "you have caused quite a scandal with your disappearance." "I am sorry for the manner of my leaving," Julia said, forcing herself to meet his gaze despite her pounding heart. "But I could not marry you, Theodore. I do not love you, and I do not wish to be your wife." "What you wish is irrelevant," Theodore snapped. "We had an agreement." "Your father's debts will be paid," Blake interrupted. "I have money saved, and I will work to pay whatever remains. But Julia is my wife now, legally married. That agreement you had with her is void." Theodore's face flushed with anger. "You took advantage of a naive girl, filled her head with romantic nonsense." "I chose this," Julia said firmly, standing up from her chair. "Blake did not manipulate me or trick me. I chose to marry him because I love him, because he treats me with respect and kindness, because I want to build a life with him. I am sorry that this leaves you in a difficult position, but I cannot marry you. I will not marry you." For a long moment, Theodore stared at her, his jaw working as though he was chewing on bitter words. Then he turned his gaze to Samuel. "This marriage, it is legal, completely," Samuel confirmed. "I have all the paperwork properly filed." Theodore stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Then it seems I have wasted my time." He looked at Julia one last time, his expression contemptuous. "You have made your choice, Miss Vance, or should I say Mrs. Ashford. I hope you do not come to regret trading security for sentiment." "I will not," Julia said quietly but firmly. "I am certain of that." After Theodore left, Blake pulled Julia into his arms, holding her tightly. She was shaking, the confrontation having taken more out of her than she had expected, but she also felt a profound sense of relief. It was done. She had made her choice and stood by it, and now she was free to move forward. "How much do you actually owe on those debts?" Samuel asked gently. Blake named the figure, and Samuel whistled low. "That is substantial. It will take you years to pay that off with ranch hand wages." "I will manage," Blake said. "Whatever it takes." But Samuel was already shaking his head. "I have a better idea. I have been looking for someone to help me with some land I own outside town. Nothing fancy, just about 100 acres that need working. If you are willing to invest your savings and your labor, we could make it a partnership. Split the profits 60-40 until your investment is paid back, then 50-50 after that. Blake looked stunned. Samuel, I cannot ask you to. You are not asking, I am offering, Samuel interrupted. I have known you for years, Blake. You are a hard worker and an honest man, and I can see clear as day that you two belong together. Let me help. After much discussion, they agreed to Samuel's proposal. It would still be hard work, still require sacrifice and dedication, but it gave them a real chance to build something lasting. 2 weeks later, Julia stood in the doorway of a small adobe house on the land she now shared with Blake. It was modest, just 3 rooms and a roof that leaked when it rained hard, but it was theirs. Every piece of furniture, every curtain and dish, was something they had chosen together. Blake came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "How different my life is now compared to what I thought it would be," Julia admitted. "A month ago, I was preparing to marry a man I did not love, to live a life of cold formality. Now I am here with you, building something real. Any regrets?" Blake asked, though she could hear the vulnerability beneath the casual tone. Julia turned in his arms so she could look up at him. "Not a single one. I have never been happier, Blake. This life with you is everything I did not know I needed." He kissed her then, deep and slow, pouring everything he felt into the connection between them. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "I am going to spend every day of the rest of my life making sure you never regret choosing me," he promised. And he did. Over the months and years that followed, Blake proved himself to be everything Julia had hoped for and more. He was a devoted husband, treating her as an equal partner in all things. When she wanted to learn to manage the ranch finances, he taught her patiently. When she expressed interest in raising chickens, he built her a coop with his own hands. The work was hard, harder than anything Julia had ever experienced in her privileged Philadelphia upbringing. Her hands developed calluses from helping with chores, and her skin tanned under the relentless Arizona sun. But she was happy, deeply and genuinely happy in a way she had never thought possible. Their partnership with Samuel proved successful. The land was fertile enough for the territory, and Blake had a knack for ranching that made their small operation profitable. By the end of their first year, they had paid off a significant portion of Julia's father's debts. During that first year, Julia also learned what it meant to be part of a community. Their nearest neighbors, a family named the Coopers, welcomed them warmly despite the somewhat scandalous circumstances of their marriage. Sarah Cooper, the wife, became Julia's first real friend, teaching her practical skills like bread making and how to preserve food for the winter. "You have come a long way from that Philadelphia lady who arrived at Fort Bowie," Sarah observed one afternoon as they worked together to put up vegetables from the garden. Julia laughed, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. "I suppose I have. Though I confess, there are days when I miss certain conveniences of city life." "But you would not trade it?" Sarah asked knowingly. "Not for anything," Julia confirmed. "This life with Blake is worth every hardship." As their second year began, Julia discovered she was pregnant. The realization filled her with equal parts joy and terror. Blake's reaction when she told him was everything she could have hoped for, his face lighting up with wonder as he pulled her into his arms. "A baby," he kept repeating, as though he could not quite believe it. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Julia asked, though she could see the answer written plainly on his face. "Happy does not begin to cover it," Blake said, his hand coming to rest gently on her still flat stomach. You have given me so much, Julia. A home, a purpose, and now this. I am the luckiest man alive." The pregnancy was difficult at times, the frontier offering limited medical resources. But Sarah proved invaluable, having given birth to 4 children herself. She coached Julia through the worst of the morning sickness and shared practical advice about what to expect. Blake was attentive to the point of being overprotective, trying to take over all of Julia's usual chores. She finally had to sit him down and explain that she was pregnant, not fragile, and that she needed to continue contributing to their household. "I just want to take care of you," Blake protested. "You and our child." "And you do," Julia assured him, taking his face in her hands. "But you need to trust me to know my own limits. I will ask for help when I need it, I promise." Their son was born on a sweltering day in August of 1880, his arrival accompanied by Sarah's steady coaching and Blake's nervous pacing outside the bedroom. When Sarah finally emerged to tell him he had a healthy boy, Blake practically flew into the room. Julia lay exhausted against the pillows, her hair damp with sweat, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a blanket Sarah had knitted. Blake approached slowly, reverently, as though afraid he might break the spell. "Meet your son," Julia said softly, shifting so Blake could see the baby's face. The infant had Blake's nose and chin, but his eyes, when they flickered open, were dark like Julia's. Blake reached out with a trembling hand to stroke one tiny cheek, his expression full of awe. "He is perfect," Blake whispered. "You are both perfect." They named him Thomas, after Julia's father, and from the moment he entered their lives, he became the center of their world. Blake proved to be a devoted father, waking with Julia for nighttime feedings, changing diapers without complaint, and spending hours simply watching their son sleep. "I never thought I could love anything as much as I love you," Blake told Julia one night as they lay in bed with Thomas sleeping in a cradle nearby. "But somehow, my heart expanded to hold him too." "I know exactly what you mean," Julia agreed, curling into Blake's side. "It is amazing, is it not? How love does not divide but multiplies." As Thomas grew from an infant into a toddler, the ranch continued to thrive. They were able to expand their small herd of cattle and add a few horses. Blake's reputation as a skilled rancher spread, and other homesteaders began seeking his advice. Julia found her own niche, using her education to teach the children of neighboring families to read and write. She held lessons twice a week in their small house, and seeing the children's faces light up as they mastered new skills brought her immense satisfaction. When Thomas was 3 years old, Julia became pregnant again. This time, she knew what to expect, and the pregnancy was somewhat easier. Their daughter, Margaret, was born in the spring of 1883, a tiny bundle with her father's light hair and her mother's dark eyes. Blake cried when he held her for the first time, overwhelmed by the perfection of his growing family. "2 children," he marveled. "How did I get so blessed?" "We both did," Julia corrected, watching as Thomas toddled over to peer curiously at his new sister. "We chose this, remember? We followed our hearts, and look at what we built." Life was not without its challenges. There were droughts that tested their resources, harsh winters that pushed them to their limits, and the constant hard work that frontier life demanded. But through it all, Blake and Julia faced each obstacle together, their love and partnership only growing stronger with time. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Blake surprised Julia with a gift. He led her outside at sunset to find a new wooden sign hanging over their door. It read Ashford Ranch in carved letters, with a small heart between their names. "This is ours now," Blake said, wrapping his arms around Julia from behind as they both admired the sign. "Samuel signed over the full partnership papers yesterday. This land, this home, it all belongs to us." Julia turned in his arms, tears of joy streaming down her face. "Blake, that is wonderful. We truly did it. We built this life together just like we dreamed." "You were worth fighting for," Blake said, cupping her face in his hands. "Worth every risk, every hardship, every moment of doubt." "You are the best choice I ever made, Julia Ashford." "And you are mine," Julia replied, pulling him down for a kiss that still made her heart race even after 5 years of marriage. That night, after the children were asleep, they sat together on the porch of their home, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Julia leaned against Blake's shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. "Do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if you had married Theodore?" Blake asked quietly. Julia considered the question seriously. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but not with regret. More like looking at a path not taken, curious but grateful I chose differently. That life would have been safe, predictable, but empty. This life with you is unpredictable and challenging, but it is full of love and joy and purpose. No part of you misses Philadelphia, the culture, the society." "I miss some things," Julia said honestly. "I miss museums and concerts and bookstores. But I do not miss the person I was there, the constrained, dutiful girl who never questioned what she was told to want. You helped me become someone braver, someone who chooses her own path." Blake pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "You were always brave, Julia. You just needed the right reason to show it." The years continued to pass, marked by the growth of their children and the steady expansion of their ranch. Thomas grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved helping his father with the cattle. Margaret was spirited and adventurous, more likely to be found climbing trees than playing with dolls. When Thomas was 8 and Margaret was 5, Julia gave birth to their third and final child, another son they named Robert. His arrival completed their family in a way that felt right and whole. Blake proved to be as devoted to his children as he was to Julia, spending hours teaching them to ride, sharing his knowledge of the land, and instilling in them values of hard work and integrity. But he also showed them tenderness, reading them stories at bedtime and comforting them through nightmares. Julia often found herself pausing in her daily tasks to simply watch her family, overwhelmed with gratitude for the life she had chosen. There were moments of profound beauty, like watching Blake teach Thomas to rope cattle, or listening to Margaret sing as she helped with the chickens, or seeing Robert take his first steps across their living room floor. But there were also ordinary moments that held their own magic. Family dinners where they all talked about their days. Lazy Sunday afternoons when they did nothing but sit together on the porch. The weight of Blake's hand in hers after more than a decade of marriage, still capable of making her feel cherished and desired. As their children grew older, Julia resumed her teaching with renewed dedication. She had continued to educate neighboring children throughout the years, but now she formalized it into a proper school. Blake built her a small schoolhouse on their property, and children from families within a 10-mile radius came to learn. Blake often joked that he had married the most educated woman in Arizona territory, but his pride in her accomplishments was always evident. He supported her teaching completely, taking on extra work around the ranch to give her the time she needed for lesson planning. "You are changing lives," he told her one evening as she graded papers by lamplight, "giving these children opportunities they would never have otherwise." "I am so proud of you, Julia." "I learned from the best," Julia replied, setting aside her work to give him her full attention. "You taught me that it is possible to build the life you want, not just accept the one you are given. I am just trying to pass that lesson on." When Julia turned 30, they threw a small celebration with their neighbors and friends. Looking around the room at the people who had become her family, both by blood and by choice, Julia was struck by how rich her life had become. Sarah Cooper pulled her aside during the party, handing her a glass of lemonade. "I remember when you first arrived in the territory," Sarah said with a knowing smile. "Refined Philadelphia lady engaged to the fort commander. I never would have predicted this." Julia laughed. "Neither would I. But I would not change a single thing about how my life turned out." "Not even the hard parts?" Sarah asked gently. Julia thought about the struggles they had faced, the years of working to pay off her father's debts, the times when money was scarce and they did not know if they would make it through the winter, the fear and pain of childbirth, the constant demands of ranch life and raising a family on the frontier. "Not even those," Julia said firmly. "The hard parts made the good parts sweeter. And I faced all of it with Blake by my side, which made even the worst moments bearable." As the sun set on her 30th birthday, Blake found her standing outside, watching the Arizona sky turn brilliant shades of orange and purple, hiding from your own party. He teased, slipping an arm around her waist. "Just taking a moment to appreciate it all," Julia said, leaning into him. 12 years ago, I thought my life was over before it truly began. I was about to marry a man I did not love, to live a life that would have slowly suffocated me. And then you came along and showed me a different possibility." "You did the hard part," Blake reminded her. "I just asked you to choose. You are the one who was brave enough to do it." "We were brave together," Julia corrected. She turned to face him, taking both his hands in hers. "I love you, Blake Ashford. I have loved you since you pulled me out of the dust after that stagecoach attack, and I will love you until my last breath and beyond." "And I love you," Blake replied, his voice rough with emotion. "You are my home, Julia, not this ranch or this territory, but you. Wherever you are is where I belong." They kissed as the sun dipped below the horizon, their children's laughter drifting out from the house behind them, and Julia thought that this moment right here was perfection. Not because everything was easy or simple, but because it was real and chosen and filled with love. The years that followed brought their own changes and challenges. Thomas grew into a young man who shared his father's love of ranching, and by the time he was 16, he was handling many of the ranch operations himself. Margaret surprised everyone by developing a passion for healing, spending hours learning from the circuit doctor who visited the area quarterly. Robert, their youngest, inherited his mother's love of learning. He devoured every book Julia could get her hands on, and she began teaching him more advanced subjects than she covered with her other students. Blake and Julia watched their children grow with a mixture of pride and bittersweet nostalgia for the babies they had been. But they also found joy in this new phase of their lives, able to take time for themselves in ways that had not been possible when the children were small. They took rides across their land, just the two of them, reminiscing about the early days of their marriage. They stayed up late talking, their conversations ranging from philosophical to practical to silly. And their physical connection remained strong, the passion between them undimmed by the passage of time. "How is it possible that I want you more now than I did when we first married?" Blake asked one night as they lay tangled together, both breathless and satisfied. Julia laughed, trailing her fingers down his chest. "Because we know each other now. We have history and trust and partnership. That makes everything deeper, more meaningful." "Wise as well as beautiful," Blake murmured, capturing her hand and bringing it to his lips. "I am the luckiest man in the world." As their 20th wedding anniversary approached, Blake began planning something special. Julia noticed his secretive behavior, the way he would disappear for hours at a time, but she did not pry. She trusted him completely, knowing that whatever he was planning would come from his heart, On the morning of their anniversary, Blake woke her early, before the sun had fully risen. "Get dressed," he said, his eyes sparkling with mischief. "I have something to show you." Curious, Julia dressed quickly and followed him outside. 2 horses stood saddled and ready, and Blake helped her mount before swinging up onto his own horse. They rode for over an hour, Blake leading the way with clear purpose. Finally, they crested a ridge and Julia gasped at the sight before her. In a valley below, surrounded by cottonwood trees and bordered by a small stream, stood a beautiful stone house. It was larger than their current home, with a wide porch and large windows that would let in plenty of light. "Blake, what is this?" Julia asked, her heart pounding. "Our new home," Blake said, his voice thick with emotion. "I have been working on it for over a year whenever I could steal time away. Thomas and Robert helped and Samuel lent some workers. I wanted to build you something worthy of you, Julia. A real house, not just an adobe cabin." Julia felt tears streaming down her face as Blake led her down into the valley. Up close, the house was even more impressive. The stonework was solid and beautiful, the craftsmanship evident in every detail. Blake helped her dismount and led her inside. The interior was spacious, with separate bedrooms for each of their children, a large kitchen, and a sitting room with a stone fireplace. But it was the room at the back of the house that made Julia's breath catch. It was a library, with built-in shelves lining 2 walls. And those shelves were already filled with books, more books than Julia had seen in years. "I have been ordering them from a dealer in Tucson," Blake explained, watching her face anxiously. "I remembered you saying how much you missed having books to read. I know I cannot give you everything you left behind in Philadelphia, but I wanted to give you this." Julia turned to her husband, this man who had spent a year of his life building her a dream, who remembered an offhand comment about missing books and turned it into a library, who loved her with such devotion that he spent his limited resources on things that would make her happy. "Blake Ashford, I love you so much it hurts," she said, throwing her arms around his neck. "This house, these books, none of it matters compared to the fact that you thought of it, that you spent your time and energy creating something beautiful for us. You are the most wonderful man I have ever known." "So you like it?" Blake asked, grinning against her hair. "I love it," Julia confirmed. "Almost as much as I love you." They moved into the new house over the following weeks, the whole family working together to make the transition. Margaret declared her new room perfect. Thomas appreciated having his own space, and Robert immediately claimed the library as his favorite spot. But for Julia and Blake, the true gift was the master bedroom with its large window overlooking the valley. On their first night in the new house, they stood at that window together, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. 20 years, Blake said softly. 20 years since I pulled a beautiful woman out of the dust and lost my heart in an instant. 20 years since a cowboy told me to follow my heart instead of my duty, Julia added, leaning back against him. Best decision I ever made. No regrets, Blake asked, though after 2 decades he knew the answer. Not a single one, Julia confirmed, turning in his arms to kiss him. Just gratitude for every moment we have had together and excitement for all the moments still to come. Their children grew and made their own paths in the world. Thomas took over more of the ranch operations, eventually building his own house on a portion of the land and marrying a local girl named Emily. Margaret's passion for healing led her to train formally as a nurse, and she opened a small clinic in Fort Bowie, finding her own measure of satisfaction in serving the community. Robert, their youngest, went east to attend university, the money for his education saved carefully over the years by Julia and Blake. He wrote them long letters about his studies, about the bustling cities and the opportunities available there. But he always came home for summers, and Blake and Julia could see in his eyes that Arizona still held his heart. As Blake and Julia entered their 50s, they found themselves stepping back from the daily operations of the ranch, turning more control over to Thomas while they focused on enjoying the life they had built. They traveled a bit, visiting Tucson and even making a trip to California to see the ocean. But they always came home to their valley, to the stone house Blake had built, to the land they had worked so hard to make their own. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching another Arizona sunset, Julia felt overwhelmed with emotion. This life, this beautiful, full, challenging, rewarding life, had all stemmed from one brave choice made more than 30 years ago. "What are you thinking about?" Blake asked, his hand finding hers with the ease of long practice. "Everything," Julia said simply. "How that frightened girl who arrived at Fort Bowie would hardly recognize the woman I became. How loving you changed me in ways I never could have anticipated. How grateful I am that you found me in that desert and showed me a different path." Blake brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her palm. "I am the one who should be grateful. You took a chance on a cowboy with nothing but dreams and determination. You built this life alongside me, working just as hard, sacrificing just as much. Everything good in my life started the moment you said yes to following your heart." "We did it together," Julia said, squeezing his hand. "That is what makes it special. We chose each other every single day, through good times and bad. And I would choose you again every single time," Blake said fiercely. "In every life, in every version of this story, I would choose you, Julia." As the sun dipped below the horizon and stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Julia and Blake sat together in comfortable silence. Around them, the ranch they had built hummed with quiet life. In the distance, they could see lights from Thomas and Emily's house, and they knew Margaret was likely just finishing up at her clinic in Fort Bowie. Their lives had not been easy, but they had been rich with love and purpose and joy. And as Julia leaned her head on Blake's shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him, she knew that every hardship had been worth it for the privilege of building this life with him. Years continued to pass, marked by the arrival of grandchildren and the slow, gentle rhythm of a life well lived. Thomas and Emily had 3 children, and Margaret eventually married a doctor who had come to assist at her clinic, giving Blake and Julia 2 more grandchildren to dote on. Robert returned from the East with a degree and a wife, a smart woman named Catherine who fell in love with the Arizona territory almost as quickly as she had fallen in love with Robert. They settled on another portion of the Ashford land, and Robert used his education to help local ranchers with legal and business matters. Blake and Julia's house became the heart of this growing family, a place where everyone gathered for celebrations and Sunday dinners. Julia would stand at her kitchen window, watching her grandchildren play in the yard, and feel a sense of completion that was almost overwhelming. "We made this," Blake would say, coming to stand behind her and wrap his arms around her waist. "This family, this legacy. It all started with us following our hearts." As they grew older, Blake and Julia slowed down physically, but their love for each other never dimmed. They spent their days reading together in the library Blake had built, taking short walks around the property, and playing with their grandchildren. On their 40th wedding anniversary, their family threw them a large celebration. Friends and neighbors came from miles around to honor the couple who had become pillars of their community. There were speeches and toasts, laughter and tears. But for Julia, the most meaningful moment came that evening when she and Blake stole away from the party to walk to the ridge, where he had first shown her the stone house he was building. They stood looking out over the valley, the house below them lit with warm light, full of the people they loved most in the world. Blake's hand in hers was weathered now, spotted with age, but his grip was still strong. 40 years, Julia marveled. Where did the time go? Into building this, Blake said, gesturing at the valley, at the life they had created. Into loving you and being loved by you. Into raising our children and watching them build their own families. It went into exactly what it should have. Julia turned to look at her husband, this man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved. His hair was white now, his face lined with age, but when he looked at her, she still saw the young cowboy who had offered her his hand in the desert. "I love you, Blake Ashford," she said, the words as true now as they had been the first time she spoke them. "Following my heart led me to you, and you gave me a life beyond my wildest dreams." "The dreams were always there, Julia," Blake said, cupping her face in his hands with infinite gentleness. "I just gave you permission to claim them." They kissed as the stars emerged overhead. Two people who had chosen love over duty, heart over obligation, and built something beautiful from that choice. The years that followed were gentler, quieter. Blake and Julia spent most of their time at home, surrounded by books and memories and the frequent visits of children and grandchildren. Their bodies might have slowed, but their minds remained sharp, and they spent hours discussing everything from politics to poetry to the antics of their youngest grandchildren. When Blake fell ill in his 70th year, Julia never left his side. She held his hand through the fever, read to him from his favorite books, and reminded him of all the adventures they had shared. "I am not ready to leave you," Blake said one evening, his voice weak but his eyes clear. "Then do not," Julia replied fiercely, squeezing his hand. "Fight, Blake. We still have so much life left to live together." And he did fight, rallying against the illness with the same determination he had shown throughout his life. It took weeks, but eventually he recovered, though he was weaker than before. "You saved me," he told Julia once he was well enough to sit up in bed. "You saved me first," Julia reminded him. "In that desert all those years ago, I have just been returning the favor." They had several more years together after that scare, precious time that they both recognized as a gift. They made the most of every day, understanding in a way they had not when they were younger that time was finite and precious. Blake passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 weeks after his 73rd birthday, Julia beside him as she had been for nearly half a century. The grief was crushing, a physical weight that made it hard for Julia to breathe. But even through her sorrow, she felt gratitude for the life they had shared, for every moment they had been given. At his funeral, surrounded by children, grandchildren, friends, and neighbors whose lives Blake had touched, Julia spoke about the man she had loved. "Blake Ashford taught me that it is never too late to choose your own path," she said, her voice steady despite her tears. "He showed me that love and partnership can weather any storm. He gave me a life full of purpose and joy and meaning. And though my heart is broken now, I would not trade a single moment of our time together, not even to spare myself this pain." After Blake's death, Julia lived for another 5 years, surrounded by the love of her family. She continued to teach until her health made it impossible, continued to be a source of wisdom and comfort for her children and grandchildren. On the evening she passed away, peacefully in her sleep at the age of 78, her daughter Margaret found a letter on her bedside table. It was addressed to the entire family, written in Julia's still elegant hand. The letter spoke of love and courage, of following your heart even when it seems impossible. It told the story of a frightened young woman who almost married the wrong man out of duty, and the cowboy who showed her a different way. "I have lived a life beyond my wildest dreams," Julia had written. not because it was easy or simple, but because it was chosen. Because I was brave enough when it mattered most to follow my heart instead of my duty. I hope you will all remember this lesson. Choose love. Choose authenticity. Choose the life that makes your heart sing, even if it frightens you. The letter ended with a request that she be buried next to Blake in the small family cemetery on their land, under the cottonwood tree where he had proposed, so that they could spend eternity together in the valley they had made their home. And so she was, laid to rest beside the man who had been her partner, her love, her home for so many years. Their headstones stood side by side, simple markers that bore their names and the dates of their lives, but also words that captured the essence of their story. Blake Stonereed. He taught her to follow her heart. Julia Stonereed. She had the courage to do it. The Ashford Ranch continued to thrive under the stewardship of their children and grandchildren, a living legacy to the love story that had started it all. And for generations, the family would tell the story of Blake and Julia, of how a chance encounter in the desert led to a love that lasted a lifetime. They told of how Blake had whispered, "Follow your heart, not your duty," to a young woman promised to another, and how those words had changed the course of multiple lives. They spoke of the courage it took to choose love over obligation and the beautiful life that had resulted from that choice. The stone house Blake had built still stood, now home to Thomas's grandson and his young family. The library was still filled with books, constantly being added to by each new generation. And the valley remained as beautiful as it had been when Blake first brought Julia there, a testament to the power of love and the importance of choosing your own path. On quiet evenings, when the Arizona sun set in brilliant shades of orange and pink, locals swore they could sometimes see two figures on the ridge overlooking the valley. A tall cowboy and a dark-haired woman, standing hand in hand, watching over the land and the family they had built together. Whether it was truth or simply the romance of legend, it did not really matter. Because the true legacy of Blake and Julia Ashford was not in ghostly appearances or dramatic gestures, but in the lives they had touched, the family they had raised, and the enduring message they had left behind. That love is worth fighting for. That duty without joy is a prison. And that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is follow your heart, even when the path ahead is uncertain and frightening. Their story became part of the Arizona Territory's lore, told and retold over the years. Some details changed with each telling, but the heart of it remained the same. A cowboy saved a woman from bandits and ended up saving her from a loveless marriage. She chose him over duty, and together they built a legacy of love. Decades after their deaths, a great-great-granddaughter named Emma would stand in that same valley, facing her own difficult choice between expectation and desire. And she would remember the story of Julia and Blake, of how following your heart can lead to a life beyond your wildest dreams. And Emma would make her own brave choice, continuing the legacy of courage and love that her ancestors had begun all those years ago in the Arizona desert. The Ashford Ranch still stands today, a working cattle operation now in its 6th generation of family ownership. The stone house has been expanded and modernized, but the library remains much as it was when Blake first surprised Julia with it. The books are different now, updated and added to over the years, but the room still serves as the heart of the home. Visitors to the ranch often ask about the 2 headstones under the cottonwood tree, about the simple words carved into the weathered stone. And the current generation of Ashfords always tell the story with pride and reverence, because Julia and Blake's story is more than just family history. It is a reminder that love is always a choice, one that must be made again and again throughout a life. It is proof that courage can come in unexpected moments, and that the bravest choice is often the one that goes against expectation. Most importantly, it is a testament to the transformative power of love, when two people choose each other completely and build a life based on partnership, respect, and devotion. Julia Vance arrived in Arizona territory as a frightened young woman, resigned to a marriage of duty and a life of cold formality. She left this world decades later as Julia Ashford, surrounded by the love of a family she had built with Blake, having lived a life full of purpose and passion and joy. All because a cowboy pulled her from the dust after a stagecoach attack and later whispered the words that would change everything. "Follow your heart, not your duty." And she did. And in doing so, she found not just love but herself, and built a legacy that would endure for generations.